So at this point, we could literally hit the review and create button and get a storage account created. So those are the minimum levels of decisions we need to make. But for the sake of this course and for the sake of this video, we're going to flip over to the networking tab. Now this has changed in the past year. By default, when you create a storage account, that storage account is accessible from anywhere in the world. Now, there is access controls and access key required, so it's not like your files are exposed, but there is a URL that represents your storage account. Let's go back to the Basics tab. Based on the name of the storage account, it's been given a URL, and you can programmatically access that storage account from anywhere in the world unless you were to put it behind a firewall. Now, the way that you do that is that you have to choose either a public endpoint that lives on a virtual network or a private endpoint. So if we chose public endpoint for selected networks, then we're going to have to choose a virtual network for it to live on. And then we can use our traditional security methods like a firewall or an NSG to restrict access to that. So I'm going to say public endpoint selected networks. Now I don't have a virtual network in the Canada Central region, so I do need to create one. So I'm going to say my new VNet. It's in the default resource group, which we're going to create. Now virtual networks do need an address range. I'm just going to accept the defaults being given here. We're not getting into the basics of how to create a virtual network in this video, but we've got a 10.2 address range, pretty wide range, and the subnet being created is small 10.2.0 range. So this storage account will be accessible only from this virtual network or from things that are granted access to this virtual network. So if you have a virtual machine that's already on this virtual network, it would have access to the storage account by default and nothing else to be able to access it. You'd have to, again, formally grant access to that storage account and put it onto the default subnet. Again, there is some behind the scenes work for modifying a virtual network to accept storage accounts. And so it's going to modify the default subnet to allow storage accounts. And this is just some technical behind the scenes stuff. If we go in the advanced tab, we're now also seeing more advanced decisions than we did in the past. By default, SSL is the only accessible HTTPS method. If you have some reason that you want to be able to access your storage accounts through a non-secure method, you'd have to actually disable it. That would be a real legacy system. I would not recommend you disable secure transfer unless you really have a good reason. There is a Azure file service, and so you could enable 100 terabyte sized files to live in the storage account, but you actually manually need to do that. Now this soft delete concept for Azure recovery services, it's enabled by default, but for storage accounts, it's not. What this means is if you were to delete a file, that file could be recovered for, in this case, up to 7 days, or I can even say 30 days. Now, this is a security measure so that someone doesn't just go in, a malicious person, and start to delete your files. Because if you can catch it within 30 days, then you can get those files back. The downside, of course, is you're charged for that time. So the fact that your file doesn't actually delete until 30 days have passed is an additional 30 days of charge. The other hassle of this, of course, is that you can't just delete your storage account when you want to because you've got soft delete on. You'd have to disable soft delete before deleting your storage account. It's just a little speed bump there. I'm not going to turn on soft delete for now. Now, data lake storage is a specialty type of storage account. This has got a different namespace. It's what they call Hadoop HDFS namespace. And so when you enable data lake storage, it's got a true folder structure. So a storage account by default has sort of a virtual folder structure. It's a container metaphor, and you can put your folders part of the blob names. But in a data lake storage, it's actually got a different file system. There is this NFS version 3, but again, it's a private preview, so it's not going to be on the exam. So we're not going to create a data lake storage. Finally, tagging is pretty consistent across all of Azure. You can use a billing code. You can use environment. So if this is a production environment, you can add prod. You can have a person's name in there. This is metadata for your resources. It's all optional. And so finally you click review and create. This will either tell you that there's some error or it will say it's good to go. I should mention here that if you have a storage account and you're like, well, this is our standard storage account, we're going to want to create these in all of our regions, in all of our subscriptions, there is a templating option. We aren't talked about, I think we've talked about the templating. No, we haven't talked about the templating part in this course yet, but you would be able to get the template for what we just did in this download template link. I'm not going to do that right now. When I click create, Azure's going to go off, deploy this, and within a few minutes, I will have my brand new storage account.